Warning. The following content contains material which may cause discomfort and/or distress upon viewing. If you require support or need to report abuse, please call the 24-hour mental health crisis line at 239-1111. And if you need to report abuse, call the Child and Family Services hotline at 295-0011 or the Center Against Abuse, Domestic Violence, and Sexual Assault Victim hotline at 297-8278. Call 911 if you are in immediate danger.
SCARS presents Survivor Hour.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Survivor Hour. I'm Debbie Ray Rivers, and I'm the executive director and the founder of a nonprofit in Bermuda called Saving Children and Revealing Secrets. And I am joined on set with Dr. Alicia Hancock, a clinical psychologist, and also a SCARS board member, Bermuda registered clinical psychologist, and also a member of our SCARS team. And we thank you for being here. You know, you might remember from our last episode that we had two brave survivors on our show telling their story of abuse and you know, some of the pain that was associated with what they went through as children. And it was really impactful. In fact, it got a lot of attention in our community. I received many calls. I think, you know, people were affected by that show. And I also know for a fact that other survivors came forward and started sharing their stories of abuse. You know, this show is all about awareness. It's about education as it relates to child sexual abuse. You know, we encourage people to come forward. This is an important topic. We want people to be talking about this. We learned a lot from that last show.
Sure did.
Dr. Hancock. And, you know, we learned a lot about how survivors are affected from the journey of abuse.
Definitely. And it was very brave of them courageous of them to come forward and tell their story that clearly encouraged other survivors to come forward with their story.
Yeah.
So it was very effective, and I'm really pleased, as I know you are.
Oh, totally. And, you know, what we realized is people weren't always doing the right thing years ago. People didn't, for whatever reason that was, I mean, they just either didn't recognize the signs or they just simply didn't react responsibly. We weren't talking about this issue years ago, but
Correct.
We have learned so much through our survivor stories.
Absolutely. And thanks to SCARS for bringing awareness to the effects of child abuse and you know, doing prevention.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. You know, let's talk a little bit about the effects, what we heard on that last show of the scars left behind after sexual abuse and, you know, how healing takes time. And revealing is part of it. We really believe that. We've always said that. But it's a different journey for every survivor.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, the ladies talked about their perpetrators in terms of what was done to them. And, you know, as they're talking, you know, you start looking at and wondering what the profile of a perpetrator is. And unfortunately, it's just very complex. Many perpetrators are, it's shocking to the community and shocking to the people that know them. So the complexity of what the profile looks like includes things like, you know, there's risk factors, there's personality factors, there's their own potential, not everybody, but sometimes they have their own trauma. But that's not always the case. So risk factors, you know, including their own abuse, their own trauma, personality disorder characteristics many times you see in perpetrators because they've mastered the ability to manipulate.
Exactly.
And so, but unfortunately, the impact of that is such that if they don't get treated or they're not held accountable for their actions, then the risk of reoffending is very, very high and very likely. So, you know, we have to, you know, as SCARS does, which is prevention.
Right.
You know.
Right. You know, especially when it comes to our parents of small children, to know what these signs are, to know how to talk to their children about body safety, and to really put up boundaries. You know, our community is so small, and we all, you know, many of us know each other. And, you know, it's hard for survivors to come forward, victims to come forward, it's let alone child victims to come forward. Sometimes they don't even know what's happening to them is wrong. It's very confusing. But usually this person who's doing this has groomed them and the family. And, you know, they want to be the best at what they are because they simply don't want to get caught. So they will, you know, they will reflect that they are a good person and everybody likes them. And, you know, it's hard to detect. A sex offender can be anyone. A sex offender can even be the parent of a child.
It could be a parent, it could be a family member, it can be a close friend of the family, it can be a coach, it can be a teacher, you know, and so you don't ever want to rule out anybody of not being or becoming a perpetrator.
Yeah. I mean, it's shocking and upsetting when you hear that a perpetrator can be a parent. I mean, I can't wrap my head around that. And I say this, you know, men who have sex with their own children, they shouldn't call themselves fathers. That's not an example of a father. To me, that's called a sperm donor. You know, because a father, when you think about a father is loving and caring and protective, nurturing.
And most fathers go out of their way to become a protector. You know, they actually rise to the occasion to be the protector of their children and their family.
Yeah. You know, the good news is this is preventable, but we have to talk about it. We can't stop awareness and prevention education because sexual abuse, it has not gone away. It's still here, and we say that all the time. And sadly, we have to continue this conversation. That's why this show is very important, because we want to continue talking about it and, you know, providing our community and beyond with the awareness of this.
Yeah, the more we talk about it, the more we shut down elements of people's tendency to minimize or to deny that this is happening, or that it's real, or that it's a problem, or even the significance of the impact, the emotional impact it has on the victim.
Yeah, and talk about some of those emotional impacts that, and we heard from our own survivors some of the things that they suffered throughout their childhood as a result of what happened to them.
Well, you know, on the basic level, there's, you know, the potential for mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, substance abuse, et cetera. I could go on. The list goes on. And sometimes those survivors seek out treatment and others don't. But the long-term impact on relationships, for instance, many people who have repressed and their abuse have a tendency to just function through life. They may have a job, they may have a family, but that doesn't mean that internally they are okay. And so sometimes when they have their own children is when they maybe decide to go and get help for themselves and start the healing process. Right. But by then they've had damaging relationships, or they have battled depression, or many times, you know, because they haven't dealt with the guilt and the shame and the humiliation and the anger, whether it's that the family didn't provide them with treatment or encourage treatment. And so it's overall damaging.
Yeah. And it really is about how we cope with these stresses in our life and what happens in our past. And, you know, there's so many different coping mechanisms. I know for me as a survivor, you know, I pushed down my stuff until I had to confront the man that abused me. And that's when I had to deal with all the things that I had been pushing down for over 40 years. You know, it can take anything as running into a perpetrator. I mean, Bermuda is very, very small.
Yeah.
We know everyone. We walk down the street, you know, there's only a certain amount of grocery stores that you can, you know, do your grocery shopping in, or, you know, going to the post office. We can run into our perpetrators. Talk about what that could do to a survivor who sees their perpetrator on the street.
Oh, it can re-traumatize them. It can cause them to, you know, have another traumatic reaction to their abuse. But it can also then piggyback on and create a domino effect in terms of reliving the shame and the responsibility, the self-blame, the anger, the guilt, and everything else. Particularly because, if a perpetrator is out, for instance, or they were never convicted, then that just creates another layer of harm to their emotional well-being.
Yeah.
Even if a perpetrator is held accountable, the victim is still going to experience potentially guilt, shame, anger, fear, etc. And then if they aren't convicted, or that was never went to trial for reasons, whether it's parents didn't report it or...
Well, can I just stop you there right there? Mm-hmm. This is so important. I just want our audience to understand that the police, I think this is a good place to say this, the police do not need the parents' permission to investigate a crime of child sexual abuse.
Correct, because it's against the law. It's an illegal act.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we need to make that very clear, because I think that was very unclear years ago. Well, I don't want to put my child through this. I don't want them to have to go on the stand. I mean, I was even persuaded in my own case with my girls, you sure you want to do this? It's going to be really upsetting. Well, no, sexually abusing children is a crime. No one is above the law. And I will encourage, support, and empower my children through this process, because I wanted them to know what happened to you was not your fault.
Right. The short-term impact only creates more empowerment to prevent long-term effects, long-term significant impact.
Absolutely. And we have made great strides in this country with children, in our courtrooms, being more sensitive to our children. And I thank the judicial and those that made that happen, because we want to encourage reporting. That, listen, sex offenders don't stop with one child.
No.
We know that.
No.
They don't. This isn't just, I had a bad day.
No.
And what upsets me the greatest is when people don't report, because they wouldn't hesitate if somebody came into their house and stole their television.
Mm-hmm.
They would report that to the police. It was theft. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't have done that. But when it comes to stealing a child's innocence, for whatever reason, whether it's protecting the perpetrator, protecting the perpetrator's family, not putting shame, thinking that it's shameful on their own family that this happened. Sometimes parents take that role on, well, I should have protected my child. People are going to think I was a bad parent. No, sex offenders are very manipulative.
And in essence, the impact, if reporting it many times, unfortunately for parents, when they don't report it, if it has a significant impact in their personal life, or may affect their personal relationships with certain people, or they have a history of their own trauma, or they're currently in an abusive relationship, or they haven't healed, then they're likely to rationalize their own narrative and telling themselves that, well, I was okay. I turned out okay. Basically I functioned and, I'm well enough. I functioned well enough. And that should never be good enough. It should never be good enough to just function, because, you see, again, the impact, missing out on experiences because of fear, the fear of being highlighted or noticed is often a characteristic of somebody that's been abused. They don't like to be the center of attention, so they avoid certain situations that put them at the center of attention. They miss out on experiences, for instance. Relationships, they don't trust, have difficulty trusting people, afraid to be vulnerable. So there's so much that's almost like a locked-in, I can't think of the word right.
Well, it's almost like I have no other place to go. I have to do this. This is.
It's like a locked-in cocoon. Like they become a locked-in cocoon. They can't, where they're so afraid to talk about themselves, to be proud of themselves, etc.
Yeah.
All because, again, the impact of being sexually abused.
Yeah. And I can't tell you how many survivors have shared with me the fact that they were forced to be around the person, They were put in a position of guilt if they went to family events where the perpetrator was. I heard someone told me about they were strongly encouraged to go to a funeral of the perpetrator, and they had disclosed that this person sexually molested them. But the word forgiveness comes in there sometimes, where you must forgive. And I think we've confused that word a little bit.
Agreed.
There is a difference between, revenge, retribution, and forgiveness. Forgiveness is not for the other person. It's for your own self. It's to not live with that hatred and anger. And that is someone else's. That's your own journey, a survivor's journey. Nobody can force somebody to that process. And we shouldn't be doing that. We should not forgive on someone else's behalf.
No, to make them feel more comfortable. It's more about, and again, to each his own. Some people can forgive and some people can work towards, say, letting go. But the purpose is letting go of the hold and the control that it has in your life, meaning how it's prevented you from having experiences and being the best version of yourself.
Yes.
Letting go of the anger, letting go of the shame, letting go of the guilt that you've held on to or, been so hypersensitive to in your life.
Yeah, which it wasn't yours. I don't care if a child, I say it all the time, I don't care if a child begs an adult to have any type of sexual contact with that adult.
No.
It's an adult's responsibility. I told someone yesterday, it's an adult's responsibility to protect children. We are not...
Put boundaries up.
Absolutely. We are not to blame children.
A child is not capable, from the brain development. The child is not capable of making those kinds of decisions.
Absolutely not.
They haven't had experience. They haven't had enough experience to make that kind of informed decision. And their kids are ever trusting of adults. They trust that if an adult is in front of a child, that child is automatically, typically going to assume that the adult is going to tell them what to do and that they have their best interests at heart, or that they're going to protect them.
Yes. And if that doesn't happen, you can understand why children say they don't trust anyone.
Correct.
They don't trust adults.
Correct.
Adults let them down. And to me, the analogy is like, if a child asks an adult to rob a bank, and I've said this before, with that child, my mommy needs the money. Can you rob that bank? That adult's not going to do that. They know the difference between right and wrong. Well, sex is the same thing. Kids do not understand that. And, this has been a conversation that's been had for years. I know for the 12 years, I've been involved in this field, and I don't care what anyone says. It's an adult's responsibility to protect children. And we know that abuse is when one exerts power over another. We also know that child-on-child abuse is very normal. Sometimes children will explore on other children, especially children who have not been educated in prevention and boundaries and consent and what that looks like.
Correct.
They may not, but it becomes abusive when one exerts power on another person.
Correct.
Puts the hand over their mouth. Threatens them, intimidates them, manipulates them into minimizing what sexual abuse is. Yes,
if
exactly.
You minimize the sexual act itself, particularly, and this is, again, something that perpetrators do to groom the child, is minimizing the behavior, the sexual behavior, so that they will agree to do it.
Yeah, and I think we get really sometimes confused with, because sometimes child-on-child, right, is normal if you have a 17-year-old with a 15-year-old. But if that 15-year-old says, no, I don't want to do this, it is about boundaries. It is about putting boundaries up. But if you have a 25-year-old with
assault.
It is. But a 25-year-old with an 8-year-old or a 21-year-old with an 8-year-old, that's a problem.
It's a huge problem.
I mean, that's a red flag.
Yeah, because children are impressionable. They're too young. They haven't, again, an 8-year-old has not had the experience, the types of experience that a 16, 17, 18-year-old has had, or a 25-year-old has had.
Yeah, and let's not forget the age of consent. We have laws in this country for a reason. And thank goodness we do have laws. But the age of consent in this country is 16.
Yeah.
And the reason it's 16 and not 18 is because the legal age of marriage is 16.
Even though the brain has not even remotely fully developed yet. Again, when you think about the brain myelinates from the back to the front. So the back part of the brain is developed first, and then it slowly goes towards the front. And this front part is the frontal lobe where the prefrontal cortex is. And that part of the brain helps us to make decisions, judgment, planning, organizing, emotional regulation.
Danger.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if that part isn't developed yet until the age of, fully developed to about 24, 25, you're asking an 8-year-old to make a decision about, about sex, something they've never done before, never talked about before. And you're putting them in a vulnerable position of, oh my gosh, this big person might hurt me if I don't do what they tell me to do.
Right.
Because they've been groomed by parents to do what you're told. You do what adults tell you to do.
Right. Exactly. That goes really back to years ago with, forcing affection on children, making children hug, being okay when you see a child being tickled and not speaking up. But this is why we encourage our community, get educated.
Yes.
Please sign up for a SCARS training session. Thanks to our corporate donors in this community and our community donors, this is free education. And it is powerful when you come into a SCARS room and you hear, you also hear survivor stories when you come in a training room. And, the Darkness to Light organization have just upgraded their Stewards of Children training. And we just launched it this in January 11th. And we're excited about it. But you'll hear survivor stories in our training. That's how we learn. That's why this show, Survivor Hour, is important, because this is how we learn about this topic. So we're going to come right back.
Stay tuned. We'll be back after these messages.
You have the power
to protect the well-being of a child.
If we're actually going to address the problem, it's all hands on deck. Will you be empowered to act?
SCARS presents Survivor Hour.
Can survivors, can victims, can they be healed? Can we heal?
Absolutely, absolutely. So whether the victim is a child currently, or if they're adult survivors of child abuse, absolutely. The sooner the better, obviously. But even adult survivors, I get many adult survivors in my office, and it's not always the first thing that pops up. It's not always in the first session that they bring it to light. So. Because myself being a psychologist and sitting in front of a survivor isn't that I'm seen as just like somebody else, a new person, and so they won't necessarily feel as though they can trust me. So I have to earn their trust just like everybody else, regardless of what my expertise is and what I do for a living. So I have to work very, carefully as well to build trust, to build a relationship where they can feel like they can be vulnerable. As far as a child is concerned, I do see children who have been sexually abused. And that really is on the onus of the parent to be willing to bring them in for treatment. Unfortunately, sometimes there's obstacles. Sometimes parents are too afraid to bring their child in for therapy. Sometimes they have the mindset of, oh, children are resilient, they'll be fine. They'll forget about it, or, they have a whole life ahead of them. And so there's a lot of variables that can prevent parents from bringing their children in.
Yeah.
But, I'm here to tell you that the sooner the better. Because the healing process can begin sooner in their development to then condition them to be healthy, emotionally healthy in the long run.
Yeah. Provide them with those tools.
Absolutely.
When those triggers come, or to help them even process, especially with children, process what actually happened.
Yeah.
Helping them, because who knows what the perpetrator has told them
Yeah.
through this, right? That it's their fault, or that they're enjoying it. Sex feels good. It can be very confusing. The guilt, or if I tell, one of my parents is going to have to leave Bermuda, or whatever the perpetrator has threatened the child with, that child is living with that as well. We don't even know half the conversation that was happening when the child was being abused, right?
Correct. And the parents have to be an active member in the treatment as well, because they need tools to help their child cope through different situations. Children are going to go through different experiences where they're going to be potentially triggered, and they don't understand, what or why this is happening to them.
Right. It could be something someone said. It could be a touch.
Yeah, you think something, as easy as, many times victims they're hypersensitive. So they many times will misread a person's comment, behavior. They might be likely be hypersensitive to rejection, not feeling good enough. And so you have to help children and parents and adult survivors understand what those triggers are.
Yeah.
So part of the healing process and part of the therapy is helping them acknowledge their experience while making it separate from their self-worth and their self-concept and how they see themselves. Because typically post-abuse, that abuse has completely derailed them and taken over their identity. Out of protection, you think about it, you kind of relive the abuse and you remember the abuse, and you're conditioned to remember it in a false sense of security, as though you're protecting yourself from it happening again, when in actual fact you're doing yourself more harm.
Right. Or even protecting the perpetrator.
And potentially protecting the perpetrator as well.
Yeah, or the family of the perpetrator.
Especially if there's pressure,
right,
to continue to have this family member or a friend or whoever the person is in their life.
Yeah,
it's very damaging.
Yeah,
and very confusing.
Yeah, exactly. I tell parents all the time, it's really important that we react responsibly when either a child discloses, because, if a child, I say it all the time, if a child feels that parent or guardian is going to kill that perpetrator, they're going to feel responsible if someone dies.
Yep, and they actually turn to actually becoming protective of the perpetrator.
Yes.
Because, a child, is going to be very sensitive to harming other people.
Yes. One perpetrator told a victim, if you tell, your mom is going to kill me, and that will make his wife very sad. Or I don't want to be responsible for if I send this person to jail. I'll be responsible for that. So they take that responsibility on, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. And in the form of, as a result of, the art of manipulation by the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And sometimes, unfortunately, the parent too, because the parent might be salvaging their own relationships with the family, their own fear of being alienated from the family.
Right. It's so complex,
it's
isn't it?
Very complex, which is why, like I said, the sooner the better that families come in and victims come in to be treated.
And for those that don't have insurance for this, I wish everyone was provided with insurance for healing from child sexual abuse. I really do. But we are grateful for the Family Center, who provide free counseling to children who have been abused.
Well, and the healing process. When I get adult clients in my office, we talk about recognizing the triggers that elicit feelings that create, damaging effects. For instance, self-sabotaging or self-destructive behaviors. Their responsibility in a relationship, in an intimate relationship, and how it affects their intimacy, how it affects their communication with their significant other. And as long as they become aware of the triggers and are aware of their sensitivities, like I said earlier, being hypersensitive to rejection, misreading comments, misreading behaviors, and reacting defensively is also a common reaction. Then if they don't recognize that and they don't know how to respond to that within themselves, then they're likely to end up sabotaging relationships over and over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dr. Hancock, in your opinion, can someone who commits a sexual crime against a child be healed?
Well, the quick answer is no. And the reason is because when a sex offender is let back out in the community, the risk of reoffending is incredibly high. The recidivism rate is very high. And so the most we can hope for is that they have received treatment to help them resist the urge to reoffend.
Right.
But you have to have an effective program while they're incarcerated to do that.
Right.
Well, perpetrators are incarcerated, they don't have access to children.
Right.
So they're not going to reoffend, or you're not going to know for sure if they can reoffend in prison.
Yeah, the trigger's not in there.
The trigger is not in there. And so, and it's different from an offender, a prisoner who is abused alcohol or abused drugs. They're coming out, and whether or not they reoffend, it typically only directly impacts them.
Right.
Which is not as risky as a sex offender coming out and reoffending and having significant long-term effects of impacting another person or a child.
Yeah,
So that will always remain a high-risk variable.
Right.
And so the most you can hope for with a sex offender as they come out of prison is that boundaries are in place to help them, prevent them from doing it again, helping them learn how to resist the urge to reoffend by way of behavioral consequences and the effects on their emotional well-being. So we just need, one, the effective program, but two, the effective variables and elements outside of when they do come out of prison to protect the community again.
Yeah.
And to protect themselves from having to go back.
Yeah. And to protect their victim.
Correct. First and foremost.
The reason that they went to prison.
Correct.
It's to make sure that victim and that survivor is protected.
Correct.
So they're not re-traumatized.
Yeah.
They didn't cause that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, everyone. So stick around. You're going to next hear from a forensic psychologist, very skilled forensic psychologist, who works with those that commit sexual crimes against children.
Stay tuned. We'll be back after these messages.
You have the power
to protect the well-being of a child.
If we're actually going to address the problem, it's all hands on deck. Will you be empowered to act?
Many times a perpetrator will not look like a bad person. In fact, in most cases they don't.
Concept to remember is that there's this common misconception that perpetrators tend to look like the bad guys in a cartoon movie, right? When you watch a cartoon movie, you see a very clear distinction between the good guy or good girl and the bad guy and bad girl. The bad guy acts like a bad guy, talks like a bad guy, walks like a bad guy, looks like a bad guy. That's what happens in cartoon movies, but that's not a reflection of real world.
This message is brought to you by SCARS, Saving Children and Revealing Secrets. Our objective is to raise awareness of child sexual abuse in Bermuda and its devastating effects on both children and their family members. Join thousands of Bermudians who have been certified and recertified. To get certified, call 297-2277 or email info@scars.pm. SCARS presents Survivor Hour.
How do we reduce risk? That is our mission at SCARS. What do we need to do to make sure that every child in our country has an opportunity to grow up healthy and whole? What can we do to reduce risk? We have on set Dr. Alicia Hancock. She is our resident expert in this field. She's a registered clinical psychologist. She's also a volunteer board director of SCARS. She sits on our board. Thank you, Dr. Hancock, for being here. Also joining us, I'm very excited about, is Dr. Eleni Belavanaki. She is a visiting expert who has had years of experience in this field. And so I'm going to allow Eleni now to tell us a little bit about you and what you do, Eleni. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm a consultant forensic psychologist. I'm registered in the UK. And I work for the Parole Board for England and Wales as a specialist psychologist chair. I have worked in Bermuda, as you know, in the Department of Corrections. I was here for a couple of years between 2014 and 2016 in Department of Corrections. And I also did some work for SCARS, as you know, as a facilitator. So I have a basic understanding of Bermuda system. And a fairly good understanding of the UK system. I must say at this point that I'm not here as a representative of the Parole Board. I'm here to talk about my own knowledge and experience in the field. And I'm also not a representative of His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. So I'm able to talk about programs. I'm able to talk about treatment and therapy. I have worked in the prison service a very long time ago. My experience has been in prison service, in medium secure units, and in community settings as a forensic psychologist.
You know, most people will say, you know, I know as a mom of 2 survivors and a survivor myself who went through the prosecution process, you know, our hope is just sex offenders go to Westgate and they never come out. That is the hope of many who have been affected by child sexual abuse. It hurts when we hear about people that use children for sexual pleasure and harm them. You know, our fear at SCARS has always been that, you know, we're concerned about sex offenders who go to prison and come out without the most effective treatment. I mean, it's no secret that we have been advocating for the Healthy Sex Program. Tell us about your experience when you were here between 2014 and 2016.
Yes. When I got the job, even before I got the job, I was told that because Bermuda is an British overseas territory, they would have to follow the guidance. They would have to follow all the programs that we do, the risk reduction programs that we do in the UK prisons. And there had been an inspection in the Department of Corrections here, which discovered that the programs that were here in place here were not the same as we had in the UK, or similar even to the ones that we had in the UK. So I was brought here as an expert to put together those programs from scratch. And my experience was that I was allowed and encouraged to implement all the programs for violence reduction, general violence reduction. I was encouraged to implement programs to do with substance misuse. And I was also encouraged to work in the Right Living House, which is a therapeutic community, and put together the programs there. When it came to the sex offender treatment programs, I did a needs analysis when I arrived, and I discovered that the program that was here already was the rolling SOTP, which was a very old program that had been discontinued in the UK. But I experienced a lot of resistance when it came to changing that program and bringing in the new programs from the UK. And to be honest, I never understood why there was so much resistance in that.
Yeah, that's very concerning because why would we not want the most effective treatment for child sex offenders? I mean, it protects children when we do that. It provides them with tools and skills on how to manage what they're going through. But we also know that we can't stop with just treatment, right? I mean, it's very important that we have the most effective treatment. That is a no-brainer. And I don't understand, other than cost, why we would not do that. I mean, it's upsetting to think that Bermuda doesn't have the most effective treatment. But
I don't think it was a matter of cost at the time because I was here. And I could have trained people the same way I trained staff. I trained, the staff in programs, and I trained officers in violence reduction. And we started Resolve, which is a violence reduction program that was not here. I brought it here. So there was no cost implication because I was employed and I had all the knowledge and experience to run the program. So they allowed me to do that with Resolve. They allowed me to do that with substance misuse programs. So there wouldn't have been an extra cost for me to start sex offender treatment programs.
right.
And that's why there is concern now that what we currently have isn't effective, and the concern that the offenders get out of prison and there are no parameters in place, or we don't know if they've what risk assessments have been done, or what is in place for them in terms of determining whether they should be released.
Yeah, I understand that. So when people eventually get released after various risk assessments and all of that we've discussed, they are subject to probation. So probation takes over, and they will have what we call a community offender manager. That's usually a probation officer. And the community offender manager is responsible for devising what we call the risk management plan. The risk management plan is basically a plan that tells the parole board what will be in place for the offender on release in order to make sure that the risk is managed and that they don't commit another offense. Most of child sex offenders will have day curfews as well. So during school times, they can't be out. They can't be out when school finishes. So they have to be in the hostel. They have to sign in the hostel, say, between 2:30 and 4 when children are out of school. They cannot go to playgrounds. They cannot go anywhere near schools. They cannot go anywhere near functions where there are lots of children. They can only have one mobile phone that is regularly checked by probation. They have weekly supervision with probation. They can be subject to electronic tagging. They're subject to polygraph testing. I mean, there are loads and loads of license conditions. They cannot they can access the internet, but they cannot delete the history on their devices. The devices have to be registered. So if they use a laptop or an iPad or a phone, those devices have to be registered with probation, and police and probation can at any time check their devices to see what they have been, the history of what they've been looking at. They cannot access pornography. I mean, that's a given. They cannot live in a house. They cannot go back to live in a house. Even when they leave the hostel, they have to have an approved address. That can be quite complicated because most sexual offenders against children have got exclusion zones. So if they have, for example, committed the crimes and the victims live in a particular area in the UK, they'll have an exclusion zone. Not so much because we think that they will repeat what they've done, because their victims are now adults in any case, but for the psychological impact. So we don't want the released sex offenders to be anywhere near that area where their victims live, because if the victims see them, even after 20 years, then that might cause psychological damage.
Yeah.
So that's an exclusion zone. So, I mean, there are so many restrictions that are in place, and that's for protection. That's for protection of children.
Yeah, it's a challenge in Bermuda because we're 21 miles long.
Yeah.
So what would you do in that case? But we have to do everything we can to make sure that the children are protected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a very kind of extensive list of requirements, which again, for a small island would seem essential, given how, there's schools everywhere.
Yes.
So there's temptation, there's access a lot more here.
Yeah. And that's why we have to rely on both. We have to rely on the license conditions, so the risk management plan. But that's why we do the treatment before they come out of prison.
Right.
But this is what we call external protective factors, which is the risk management plan, the license conditions, the input from probation, and the internal strategies. The internal strategies is mainly therapy. It's what they've got, the techniques that they've got personally, that they've learned that will help them to stay safe.
Yeah. Because we don't want to set them up to fail. I mean, if we don't do all of this, it may cause them to act on their urges. If we don't make sure everything is in place to protect themselves, not only to protect children, but to protect themselves. What happens if an offender violates one of those conditions? Tell me what happens then. Can they get a lawyer and they go back to court, or what happens in that case?
If it happens, we have something that's called a recall. It could be an emergency recall. So if it's during the night or if it's during the weekend, it could be an emergency recall. So the police, so they get arrested. If there's a concern, they will get arrested. If it's an emergency recall, probation, they don't even need input from probation. They will take them straight back to prison. So they go back to prison, and they have to. There are two ways of progressing from that. Either that will be a 28-day recall. That is unusual for child sex offenders, or it will be a normal recall. Normal recall means that they go straight back to prison, and they will need to be assessed by the parole board. So they might end up just for a breach of a license condition. So if they're found with pornography, or if they're found near a school, sitting outside a school, or if they're found alone with a child without somebody else supervising, they go back to prison, and then they have to apply for parole again. So that means that they could be in prison for another 18 months. And a lot of them will have to have additional treatment, additional therapy in prison, because obviously they didn't do very well in the community. They entered their high-risk situations. So they have to go back to treatment and understand that there are high-risk situations and understand why they breached their license.
So if a child sex offender is investigated, charged, convicted, released, and they are a parent, can they live with children when they are released from a UK prison?
No.
They can never live with children.
They don't have access to their own children.
No. The only access they would have to their own children, or any children, would be with supervision. They wouldn't live in the same household. In fact, they cannot live in the same household with any children, whether they're their children or other children. They cannot live in a household where there are children visiting regularly.
Right.
So the only way that people would have access to their children would be in a family center with supervision, with professional supervision, not a family member supervision, professional supervision.
Yeah. And our hope is that Bermuda gets there one day. It really does.
Well, because I think the concern is that, when offenders go to jail currently here, they go to prison, that if they refuse to do the program, and they do their time, so to speak, and they get out, then there are a lack of parameters in place or expectations, because in prison they have no access. They don't have temptations. So if they don't refuse to go to the program, then how do we know their belief system has changed about children or about what they did?
That's right. Yeah.
And also the responsibility is also for organizations who opened their doors to children,
Correct.
for adults in the community, to make sure that they're doing everything. I think you shared with me something in the UK, and I don't remember what it's called, forgive me, but an organization has to do a background check. Any organization that works with children are going to have children volunteer there. There is a list of things, or even vulnerable. I think in the UK, it's not even just for it's child offenders. It's also for
any employment or voluntary positions. There has to be a DBS check. But also, if anybody wants to work with children or even vulnerable adults, there's an enhanced DBS. So people would know, employers would know, and everybody would know that they have criminal convictions. But there are certain jobs that they're not allowed to do ever.
Right.
So they're not allowed to do them. So, and that could be on their license. That could be on their license to say you are never going to be a scout leader. You are never going to be a teacher. You're never going to be a personal trainer for children. So, these are jobs that they're excluded immediately.
I receive a lot of calls from the community. I just recently received a call of a concerned mom who went to an event, and a released convicted child sex offender was there with a COVID mask around his face. Whether he was afraid of COVID or whether he was afraid of being seen, I don't know. But there were a lot of children at this location.
Well, in the UK, that person would have been arrested and sent back to prison immediately.
If he had, because
they would be breaching. Yeah, they would be breaching their conditions.
Right.
Yeah. The reality is we cannot be 100% sure that any treatment program will be 100% effective.
Right.
It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, right.
And some people are able to, to fool the system somehow. So there will be people. That's why you have to have both. You have to have both the treatment and hope for the best. And use the most effective treatment program, but also you have the license conditions, because in the cases where the treatment hasn't really worked as it should,
Right.
then at least you've got license conditions in the community. So you've got two ways of managing that risk and high risk situations.
Well, and you have to have the licensing effects because they're being put back in the community where they will have access to children.
Absolutely.
So,
and also what we do have in the UK is that most sex offenders do not get released immediately into the community. A lot of sex offenders have to go through open conditions. We call it open conditions, a category D prison. So it's an open prison. So very few people would get released from a closed prison like Westgate straight into the community. They would have to spend a period of around 2 years sometimes in an open prison where it almost mirrors what happens in a hostel in the community. So they have to come back and sleep in the prison, but they are out. They can be out in the community working during the day. But that happens very gradually. So they will, once they are transferred from a closed prison to an open prison, the first few times they will only go out with prison officers. They will be escorted into the community. Then gradually they get to the point where they can go out in the community unescorted. Then gradually get to spend one night out in an approved hostel, then 2 nights, 3 nights, up to 5 nights out. So that is all preparation. And during that preparation time, they have to provide evidence that they are actually using the techniques that they've learned in the programs.
Yeah.
So when they've completed that period, then we have to check to see how they've done in their time out. Whilst they were in the open prison. Once that is completed, then they can apply for release.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very gradual process, because you can't just have somebody who is very high risk, who's committed very serious offences, go from a closed prison straight out in the community.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
They have to be tested.
Yeah.
Some of those people have been in prison for 20 years. How do we know? How do we know how they're going to respond when they see children outside? They see children on TV, they see children in magazines, but it's not the real thing. So how do we know? That's why we test them in a gradual way.
Right.
So it's
Give us an example of a low-risk child sex offender.
Don't think there is a low-risk child sex offender. I'm not sure I understand the question, actually.
I don't think there's any low-risk child sex offender either. I just want to know what would be an example of a low-risk offender who sexually harmed a child.
I don't, in my whole career, and which is probably around 25 years and 12 years on the parole board, I have never seen any child sex offender be released at low risk from prison. They are all released at high risk, which means they have to have an appropriate management plan. So they're all really 10 years later, if they are assessed by probation 10 years later, their risk might might be medium, might be low, but that's after they've been tested outside for 10 years, that they've not committed any offences, they've never breached their license, they've provided evidence that they know how to manage their risk. So, but on release, I have never seen a child sex offender be released on low risk.
Yeah.
They're all high risk.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which makes complete sense because, like you said, they haven't had
Testing.
any tests that they have to prove themselves
Yeah.
when they go back into a restricted community.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would hope that family members of child sex offenders take this seriously, listen to this show, hear it, because you want to be able to not only protect children, but you want to make sure that the person in your life that you care about, because sex offenders do have people in their life that care about them, and we understand that. But they have to also support the offender to understand what their risks are, and do the right thing. We have to take this very, very seriously. And Bermuda, we can do better. We've seen huge progress in child sexual abuse in this country. We've seen organizations do the right thing and get educated and ask for background checks. We've seen it. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Bermuda is leading when it comes to child sexual abuse prevention. This is an area that we can do better. And our hope is that the powers that be will make sure we have the most effective treatment program at Westgate. Our powers that be will make sure that we have strict licensing conditions for any offender that has committed a sexual crime against a child, no matter if you think that's, a lesser offense or something as serious as rape. It doesn't matter. Any person who uses children for sexual pleasure, we must take that seriously. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Dr. Hancock. And thank you, Dr. Lainey Belavanaki, for being here. We really appreciate it.
Did you know that we should always be aware and take notice of changes in a child's behavior?
Well, one of the first and most highlighted ways that indicates potential sexual abuse or any abuse is when a child is behaving differently. If a child is behaving differently, that's the first sign that something's wrong and it needs to be addressed.
It's important to take note of a child that is acting out or frustrated. These can be reactions to trauma.
So it's important for teachers to understand that when a child is acting out, or when a child is behaving irrationally or seemingly irrationally, when a child is angry or upset or frustrated, and it seems to be at an extreme level, these can be reactions to trauma.
Always keep in mind that it may be difficult for a child to express what has or is being done to them by a perpetrator.
In my experience, it has been often tough on the surface to figure out that what a child is experiencing is that they're being abused or sexually abused by a perpetrator. And that's often because the signs and symptoms that they show sometimes aren't as clear as you think they might be. Kids don't have rules about how to deal with this kind of stuff. And they're worried about getting in trouble. And they're worried about what happens. And this is an uncomfortable conversation for adults. So I can't imagine how tough it would be for a child to explain any of this stuff in a way that would make sense.
This message is brought to you by SCARS, Saving Children and Revealing Secrets. Our objective is to raise awareness of child sexual abuse in Bermuda and its devastating effects on both children and their family members. Join thousands of Bermudians who have been certified and recertified. To get certified, call 297-2277 or email info@scars.bm.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm excited to have on set Miss Cindy Clark. She is the Director of Public Prosecutions in Bermuda, and also Adley Duncan, who represents the Crown Counsel. And so welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for being here. The job that you do is vitally important when it comes to the sexual abuse of our precious children and prosecuting offenders. That's really about accountability for our survivors. We know that sexually abusing children is against the law, and no one's above the law. These cases are investigated, they're reported, investigated, and then passed on to our Department of Public Prosecution. So I just want to ask, shame is one of the emotions that plays a major role in the silence of this issue, child sexual abuse, of those that are hesitating to report or afraid to report. What do you think? What do you think also holds survivors from coming forward, or families of survivors to making that call, that first call? What do you think holds them back?
So I think you're right. Shame is a very strong factor, as well as embarrassment. For the people that I've met who get to have their matters prosecuted, because not everybody will actually get to that point, but those who come to see us because we're preparing a prosecution hold a shame not only for what has happened to them, but sometimes they hold shame as to what took them so long to report,
Right.
or why they didn't stop it when it happened. Even children, they hold a bit of a shame because they don't know how to deal with things and they aren't sure. And I find personally that a lot of them still come believing they've done something wrong, and that's what's put them here.
Right.
So shame is a big one. Embarrassment is more than just, the shame factor. They're embarrassed to have to speak to a stranger about what happened.
Right.
They are embarrassed that they find themselves in this circumstance. They are worried about any public attention to it. So I find a lot of times I have to explain to people that their names will not be publicized.
Yes.
So that is at least what I've experienced in my time. Adley, I don't know about you.
I think fear might be another emotion that affects reporting.
Yeah.
And fear has different dimensions and components. It could be fears about the unknown. What will happen if I report? It could be fear because they've been threatened by the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And Bermuda is a small community, relatively speaking. Could be fears about reputational damage, because of course stigmas attached to victims of these offenses, even though they've done nothing wrong.
Right.
So I think the different components of fear, in addition to the embarrassment and the shame, all compound to make it difficult sometimes for victims to come forward.
It really does. And, what SCARS in the community is trying to do is break down those walls, through our training and through our awareness to let, children know that, this has nothing to do with them. I don't care if a child begs an adult to have any type of sexual contact. It is never a child's fault. And with the issue of shame, that needs to shift. That needs to shift to the person who committed this horrible offense against an innocent child. And so, we really are strongly in Bermuda, advocating for education and awareness so that children understand, nobody has the right to touch your private body parts or make you feel uncomfortable in any way. And if anyone ever does, they must tell a safe adult. And we really want to work with our parents to understand this is important. This is a crime. And, do you think because 90% of people who harm children are people we know or trust, that plays a major part? Would you agree?
So that is actually one of the aspects of the fear that I've discovered amongst survivors, is the fear of what's going to happen to the perpetrator.
Right.
A lot of them are not yet ready to have that person removed from their lives completely. And then they also have the fear of how the rest of their own circle and community might take that this person has been removed from society because of what they've done to the survivor.
Right.
That is a big fear that I find, even amongst the smallest of children, are worried about what's going to happen to the perpetrator.
Yeah. And many times the perpetrator tells them that. If you tell, I'm going to get in trouble. I might have to go to jail. You're going to be responsible for that. Think about whether it was a grandfather or a family member. Think about what Grammy's going to think or Grandma's going to feel. She's not going to have a husband. You can just hear what perpetrators use to silence their victims.
Certainly in many family structures, like so-called traditional family structures, it's often the man, the adult man, the adult male who is the provider financially.
Right.
And so it's very complex where that person is the offender, because now there are very realistic considerations about who provides for the family after the report is made. And these are very, very complex emotions that have to be unpacked, and even adults could find them very difficult to unpack. So imagine a child who lacks the maturity to unpack them. It's very difficult to contemplate.
Yeah, there's just no way that they can feel good about doing something like that, because they're taking that blame on their little shoulders and say, if I do this, Mommy's not going to be able to pay the bills, or we're going to have to go back to, I heard one survivor say, we have to go back to Portugal, and we won't be able to stay in Bermuda. There's so many things that they use, and that child takes that on themselves, on their little shoulders, and say, this is what will happen, because many times the perpetrator tells them that. They want to keep the child silent. That's the goal of the offender, right?
And one of the things I have to add to that is it's not always just the offender, but those who are also familial support to the child, because I have had circumstances where the child reports to a parent and the parent says, okay, well, that's terrible, but if daddy has to go to prison, we can't do A, B, and C. So it isn't even just the offender sometimes, but sometimes those who support the children don't really consider the effect of what they're saying to them.
And that effect may not come out till years later when that child becomes an adult and says, why did you do that? You know, you knew he did this. You knew they did this to me. And you stuck up for that person. They might pay that price many years later, because when they're a child, they're thinking, oh, okay, mommy knows best. But then they become mature, they become an adult, and they're like, wait a minute, that should not have happened. And then that can cause relationships with the child and the spouse or the relative of the offender. Yeah, I mean, this is complex. It's really difficult to try to get the education out there to say, because I can tell you as a survivor and a mom of two survivors, one of my daughters did feel responsible that she was going to send him to jail. And I said, no, absolutely not. One of the other things I had to say to my children was, he may not go to jail. I had to prepare them for the worst. I had to say, but we still did the right thing by reporting, because harming children, significant harm, as the Children's Act reads, is sexual abuse. That's considered significant harm. Is a crime. It's against the law. So you won't be sending him to jail. He will be sending him his own self to jail.
Exactly.
He did this. Those are because of his actions. But children do take that on. And also if they think that the family member is going to hurt the perpetrator. We always say be very careful in the way that you respond when a child discloses. Because if a child thinks that that parent or that caregiver is going to hurt someone, that child is going to shut down and not tell, because they don't want their relative, the parent, if it was a family member or a coach or a babysitter or a clergy or anybody, they don't want their parent hurting that person and then go into jail.
Right.
Isn't that a huge part of it?
It is. And I know that SCARS does a lot to educate people about how they should respond when a child makes a report to them, because I have had examples where the person who's reported to will say something, oh, well, that wasn't so bad. In a reaction, I think, to make the child feel better. But then what happens is the child thinks, oh, well, it wasn't that bad, so maybe I don't have to say anything.
Right. Right.
We always talk about the ones where the parents say, oh, I would kill so-and-so. And then, as you know, children then internalize that and don't want to tell anybody else as well. So
absolutely,
it is important how those who are reported to react to the report.
And that's why the Darkness to Light Stewards of Children training is so important in communities, because it teaches how to react responsibly. You're learning this before anything ever happens. As a parent or a guardian, you're going, okay, if this ever happened, I remember from that training, I am not to say I'll kill somebody if they hurt my child.
Right.
I think that's so powerful. What advice would you give to family members of child victims when it comes to these child sexual abuse cases? If you had to give advice to the parents and guardians of children who have been sexually harmed, what advice would you give?
Well, from my part, the advice that I would give would be to remember that support is ideal, because a child ultimately wants to be believed. And with all these complex emotions that we've been discussing, a child wants to know that if I speak up bravely, I will find support in the person I'm reporting to. And of course, the adult may themselves have very complex emotions and reactions, but they have to remember that they are the adult and this is the child. So I think support is the key factor. So even in the office, Ms. Clark has been very, if I may say, proactive in training us internally and reminding us about the need to be particularly sensitive in dealing with child victims, because these are children who've dealt with a very difficult experience, who are now speaking publicly and openly about the worst experience of their entire lives. And so sensitivity and support are probably the two most important things I would encourage any family member to have in dealing with a report of this nature.
Wow. I mean, that's huge. And I want to say thank you, Cindy, to you and your team, because that is vital. I mean, think about, like you said, the trauma. Then they build this courage to go through with this. They need the support all around. And even the family members of survivors, of the victims, they need support from other people in their life.
True.
Empower them. Tell them you're doing the right thing. I know this is not going to be easy. I mean, in fact, SCARS created an empowerment guide for our survivors and families of survivors when they go through that prosecution process. And it is, thanks to Cindy, it's held at the Department of Public Prosecution as just this extra layer. We can never have enough support as it relates to child sexual abuse. Is that right?
That is true.
Yeah.
That's true.
What I want to do is ask this next question. You know, cases are built on evidence, right? And usually there's no evidence in child sexual abuse. So, you know, perpetrators are very wise. They're very manipulative, deviant. They know how to do this, commit this crime in usually isolated areas. They're not going to be sexually harming a child in front of their spouse or in front of their family member or in front of their coworkers. No, they're going to look for spaces where they can commit this crime in isolated situations where nobody's watching. You know, I want to ask, unless it's child pornography, usually those cases there's evidence, right? Can't get away from that because you find that information in people's computers, and you know that's probably an easier case to prosecute. Would you say than when there's no evidence of a child's word?
Okay, let me start with that, because evidence isn't just forensic evidence or DNA or things like that. So that's one, I'm going to call it a myth. I mean, no disrespect to you, but that's one myth that the public seems to have. And what Mr. Duncan or Adley and I would always tell a jury is evidence isn't just what you would see on CSI.
Love it.
So the child's word could very well be enough.
Right.
There are trained investigators who know how to speak to children. They know what we call evidence, which is a much broader aspect than just forensics. So they will know what sort of questions to ask to make sure a child's story is as solid as it can be.
Right.
And that can be enough. A child's word can be enough. Now, it's nice to have the extra evidence in forensics and things like that. But like you mentioned, these types of offenses don't happen in front of other people. But there are other portions of the story that can be what we call corroborated. Other people can back that child up.
Yes.
So for example, if the child says, it happens on the days my mommy goes to work, and he's left to babysit me, then we can check with mom, what days do you go to work? Who's the babysitter? That supports the child. If the child says things like he always went into a particular drawer to get something, then we can go to the house and look and see, is there a drawer there?
Right.
Could this be true? So we don't necessarily have to rely upon forensics. We don't need DNA.
Right.
But we can still make a case without it.
Right.
I don't know if you have any particular experience on that.
And only to piggyback and to follow up that, I think this brings into focus the role of the prosecutor, because when we are speaking with a jury, we know that jurors are coming to court with preconceptions, right? Some information is correct, some isn't. And the prosecutor is almost like a teacher in deconstructing these myths and preconceptions and really educating members of the public, which now sit as the jury, as to what actually constitutes evidence. So the very things you're saying, that people don't tend to rape children in the middle of the town square. People don't necessarily, because people expect that there's some kind of manual as to how victims should behave, and that's not how life works.
Right.
So the role of the prosecutor is to destigmatize and deconstruct these myths and help jurors to understand that there's no one way for a child to react, that these things often happen privately, that these are things that don't often lend themselves to being immediately observable.
Right.
And once that education takes place in a courtroom context, I find it's easier for the evidence of the child to be received.
Yes. I love that. And I thank you for that explanation, both of you. This is about learning, everyone. This is about educating ourselves on cases of child sexual abuse. It's very, very important. One of the things that I think has been really, educational in our community is learning the signs, recognizing the signs of a child who has been sexually abused. And I'm sure that really helps, when it comes to building these cases, whether it's depression or suicidal thoughts, acting out, eating disorders, drug and alcohol, dropping out of school, getting involved in crime, crying out for someone to see, withdrawn, right? All of a sudden, they're not interested in going to school anymore. They don't want to be around this person anymore. You can see that change, or they were so excited about a favorite activity or after school, activity, and then suddenly no more. They don't want to do music anymore. They don't want to do dance or whatever it is, volleyball, whatever that can be. Does that really help in recognizing, help build, when it comes to emotions and change of behavior?
So, yes, is the answer to that, as long as people can recognize, that there's been even a subtle shift in certain things. Obviously, that's long before we are personally involved in the matter.
Right.
One of the things I've noticed over the years is that survivors who are under 16, let's just say, or even under 18 to a certain extent, are not keen to keep talking about it, right? They may have told whoever they originally reported to, they've then told their story to probably a social worker, and then to a police officer, and then months later, they're talking to a prosecutor who is asking probably a lot more probing questions than what may have been asked of them before. So that realization and my time with SCARS has caused me to change in our office how we meet with children who are survivors. So we have a mandatory at least 3 meetings with the child before we're even asking them to
love that
to get ready, to get on the stand. The first meeting, we literally just talk, we introduce ourselves, we get to find out what the child likes or doesn't like. So I'm famous for what's your favorite color, if it's something that we're doing in the magistrate's court. If it's a small child, their favorite candy, that sort of thing. So that when we come to the second meeting, I'm wearing their favorite color.
Oh, wow.
I've got their favorite food, candy or popcorn or whatever available for them to talk to me. And I'll explain to them that we're here to talk about what happened, but I'm not going to ask them to tell me yet. And then by the third meeting, I say, okay, now it's time. You know me now.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what happened?
Yeah.
And sometimes even then, if they're not ready for it, but you have to build a relationship with the child for them to trust you, because you're brand new to them, right? And they've been hurt by someone they've been trusted, who they trusted.
Yeah.
So
they might not trust anyone anymore.
It's true.
Wow. I mean, that is really a place that Bermuda has come. I mean, we should be very proud in this country where we have come, because we are now sensitive to the needs of children in court, in these proceedings. And I tell you what, we've come a long way since I walked through the doors of the Department of Public Prosecution with our own case, and so we're grateful. I mean, children, sometimes if they've been abused, maybe they'll feel safer with a female or safer with a male. It really is thinking about the needs of the children. And now we have the witness care unit, which is not what I had back in 2004. And it's just, we've just come so far, and, we're grateful for awareness and education, and we're grateful for our judicial, for also really thinking about what is it that we need to do to take care of these children. These are children, they're not adults. With only a few years in this world, we have to be sensitive to their needs. So we are beyond grateful to the Department of Public Prosecution for the changes that they have made, and really thinking about our families and our children. So we'll be right back.
Stay tuned. We'll be back after these messages. Did you know that we should always be aware and take notice of changes in a child's behavior?
Well, one of the first and most highlighted ways that indicates potential sexual abuse or any abuse is when a child is behaving differently. If a child is behaving differently, that's the first sign that something's wrong, and it needs to be addressed.
Very important for healing, but it can be a very difficult conversation to have.
There is no doubt that this is a risky topic. We know about it, but we don't want to talk about it. On the other side, it is a hot potato topic as well, that we just prefer to send it to throw it to somebody else. If we want to heal as society, as church, as society generally, we have to be able to touch the wounds of the past.
As adults, we have a responsibility to protect children.
They're not capable of protecting themselves. They rely on adults to protect them. So it is up to us. We have a very huge responsibility to do everything we can to make sure that their needs are met, and that we have the knowledge on knowing what to do when something happens to them.
This message is brought to you by SCARS, Saving Children and Revealing Secrets. Our objective is to raise awareness of child sexual abuse in Bermuda and its devastating effects on both children and their family members. Join thousands of Bermudians who have been certified and recertified. To get certified, call 297-2277 or email info@scars.bm. SCARS presents Survivor Hour.
Welcome back, everyone. We are on set with Cindy Clark, the Director of Public Prosecutions, and Adley Duncan, Crown Counsel, and we are very grateful that you both are here, providing our audience with lots of wisdom around this issue of prosecuting child sexual abuse cases. One of the things that gets my blood pressure up is, why do offenders automatically get 2/3 off their sentence?
Well, that's a good question. So that's a politician's decision. So how it works is everyone who's sentenced can apply for parole after serving 1/3 of their sentence, unless a judge makes a specific order which says they have to serve half or 10 years, whichever is the higher. So, but that is the reason why people get it automatically, is the politicians passed a law that says that is what has to happen.
So it's almost like a little reward, in my personal view, as a survivor of child sexual abuse. That's why we have to make sure the parole board really interview offenders, making sure, in my personal view, that they are ready to be released into the public. Because this is a very serious crime. Children are at risk, or the children in a country are at risk. So I understand that now. Thank you very much. That helps. Let's talk a little bit about sentencing. I think people in the public, when you read, in articles about sex offenders who have been prosecuted and sentenced, if they don't get life, I think some people are like, what? And we know that that's not practical, but, explain a little bit about sentencing.
So I'll tackle this one. So I think sexual offense cases that involve children, they legitimately and naturally create this very high sense of revulsion. And I think that's normal, and I think that's appropriate. The reason I start there is that these reactions are very often, rightly so, emotionally driven. And if I could borrow an expression from the DPP, no sentence may feel high enough for a victim of a sexual offense, right? Because these are life-changing events.
Right.
But a judge, by virtue of the training and work and experience that a judge does and a judge has, a judge is not allowed, is not permitted to make an emotional sentencing decision. Because, of course, the rule of law is something that any civilized country has to work under and work within. And the rule of law means that if there is a maximum for a sentence, if there is a precedent for a sentence, if there are these objectives for sentencing, then a judge has to apply those. And we're talking about centuries of common law, literal centuries from England till now. We're talking about statutes passed by Parliament. We're talking about sentencing guidelines promulgated by a former Chief Justice. So there are a lot of materials that a judge has to use to deliver a sentence. And there are a lot of variables and components and moving parts and objectives and so on that a judge who is judicially trained has to consider. So when all those things are brought to bear, and usually there are published sentencing remarks that persons can go through, there's a reasoning shown to the route taken to a sentence. So it will never feel like enough.
Right.
But a judge cannot be ruled by emotion, because a country, a judicial system, a criminal justice system cannot operate on the emotions of a singular judge. There has to be a body of precedent that a judge looks towards and contributes to. And that's why sentences are what they are. They're based in something that anyone can refer to, even if it doesn't feel like it's appropriate, because an individual has an individual case that is very, very important to them, but a judge deals with a body of cases and can't treat an individual case separate from others. And that's what it is.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, as a survivor who went through prosecution myself for a historical case, as you might remember, in 2017, the perpetrator was sentenced to the time of when the laws applied to 1972. Right. And that's another thing in historical cases.
Right.
It's not what is applied now and precedents now, it's what was applied the year that he sexually molested me.
Right.
And to be honest, the fact that it was now, whether he went for 3 months, I think is what his sentence was, to 5 years, what was more concerning to me is when he got out, he's not going to do it again.
Right.
That another child is not going to be at risk. And that's why treatment is so important, the proper treatment at Westgate so that we can provide offenders who do get out after 3 months, 18 months, 3 years, they have the tools and also the license conditions to know, this is what happens when I have these thoughts, and this is my support group, and I know what will happen if I don't abide by this. There's a consequence.
Yeah.
So that really cleared it up. I really appreciate that. My last question is, years ago, we used different words to describe what really happens to children. So I remember, we would say, he interferes with children, stay away from him. Interferes, like that's such a nice word for violating a child sexually. Like, we've got to stop using that word. I've said it for many years because it minimizes the act, it really does. And the pain that a survivor goes through. Look up the word interfere. It means impede. I mean, I can't remember all the other definitions, but it certainly doesn't mean sexual violation of a child. It really doesn't. And so one of the words that I hear in the law that really, another thing that gets my blood boiled is carnal knowledge. I have always been under the impression carnal knowledge relates to rape. Is that what is carnal knowledge?
So
what does that mean?
So
that word.
There are various different phrases that are used in the law to talk about what you've referred to as sexual violation. And there are various different grades of sexual violation. And I know that sounds terrible, but there has to be someone who decides what's considered to be minor and what's, absolutely horrific. So there are different grades by definition in the law. So carnal knowledge simply means penetration of the vagina or the anus by a penis. It doesn't in any way lessen or increase. It just talks about a particular type of assault. We have sexual exploitation, which is broader, and sexual assault, which is even broader than that. So while words like carnal knowledge invoke a lot of emotion, or like rape invokes a lot of emotion when you say it, the definition of rape by itself was too constricting, right? So that's why we should be grateful that we have something called sexual assault. I know it doesn't give the same emotive feeling of violence, but the law sees it as violent. And rape was very specifically a penis to a vagina, whereas sexual assault could be anything, because we know that when these offenses occur, it isn't always just a penis to a vagina. So the fact that the law has taken those offenses and broken them into separate categories is a good thing.
Yes.
And it allows us to narrow in to the type of violence that was actually being done to the child.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't know if I feel much better about it, but I understand. We get that. One thing we can say, everyone, is it's all traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's looking at a child's naked body on a device, whether it's asking a child to touch the adult's naked body parts, whether it's the adult touching the child's naked body parts, whether it is, sex, inserting a penis in a vagina or in the buttocks. It's all traumatic. It's all damaging. It will affect a child. And so, but this is how, this is why this show is very important, because we as a community need to be educated. We have to understand when we read things in the newspaper what that means, because we're already emotive from the whole idea of a child being harmed, right? Sexually harmed. But when we have the facts, it really helps us react responsibly to this issue. So on behalf of SCARS, I do want to say Cindy is a board member of SCARS. She has been sitting at our table for many, many years. She is a woman of action and has a huge heart for children. And we are very grateful for Cindy and for the Department of Public Prosecution. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.